Hello, this is Dean Kernut, and welcome to the Alpha Exchange, where we explore topics in financial markets associated with managing risk, generating return, and the deployment of capital in the alternative investment industry. Market risks come in all shapes and sizes. A good starting point might be to categorize them as economic, financial, or monetary. But increasingly, and unfortunately, geopolitical risk is a threat that must be closely monitored and understood. And in this context, it was a pleasure to welcome Robert Dannenberg to the Alpha Exchange. Spending his entire career as an operations officer in the CIA, Rob served in various leadership positions, including as both Chief of Operations for the Counterterrorism Center and Chief of the Central Eurasia Division. With 2 tours of duty in Moscow, he faced off against Russian counterparts, and in Rob's words, his role was to, quote, steal their secrets and break their stuff. Our conversation is primarily focused on the Russia-Ukraine conflict and in gaining a better understanding for what drives Vladimir Putin. Here, Rob asserts that while perhaps deeply flawed, Putin has a highly convicted interpretation of history, citing a speech back in 2007 in Munich where he laid out a list of grievances about the West. To gain a more complete picture of the conflict in Ukraine, one must also understand the developing partnership between Russia and China. Rob tells us that Putin and Xi don't just share a strong common worldview, but are also close friends committed to pushing back against the West. And with respect to China specifically, Rob absolutely sees the Taiwan situation coming to a head, as Xi is determined to achieve what he views as a legacy issue of reincorporation with the mainland. If geopolitical risk is often more bark than bite, Rob's perspective makes a strong case that global developments are increasingly complex and must be paid close attention to. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Alpha Exchange, my conversation with Robert Dannenberg. My guest today on the Alpha Exchange is Robert Dannenberg. He is the former Chief of Operations of the Counterterrorism Center and the Chief of the Central Eurasia Division within the CIA, a division and government entity he spent many, many years in before retiring. Rob, it's fantastic to connect and have you on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. It's really a pleasure to, well, for one thing, reconnect with you and your audience. I feel that over the last few years, we've had the opportunity, mostly very pleasantly, in very pleasant environments, to exchange a lot of thoughts on current geopolitical risk and have a little bit of fun at the same time. And I hope that spirit carries into this podcast. For those of you not familiar with my background, other than what Dean just said, I did spend just about 24 years in the Central Intelligence Agency, all of it as a clandestine operative. And if you're not familiar with the architecture of the agency, basically it's broken down into 4 tribes, for lack of a better way to describe it. One are operations officers. Those are the clandestine operatives. Their principal responsibility is espionage, which means stealing secrets, and covert action, which means breaking things or blowing things up. I spent my entire 24 years in the operations directorate. The second major element, if you will, of the agency is the analytical cadre. As the name suggests, it's called the Directorate of Intelligence, formerly Directorate of Analysis. These are the people that take the open source information and the information collected from all source intelligence, including clandestine, and try to formulate it into some sensible intelligence guidance and policy guidance for the national security community. The third tribe, if you will, are the science and technology guys. They make all the whiz-bang gear that helps clandestine operatives execute operations to steal secrets or break things. And then the fourth tribe, if you will, is the administrative guys. They're the people that make sure they do the logistics for the agency, and they're stunningly effective in that role. As Dean mentioned, I have several significant leadership responsibilities in the agency, having spent my entire career as an operations officer. But my principal command positions were the chief of the Central Eurasia Division, which is responsible for CIA espionage and covert action operations in the then 26 countries of the former Soviet Union and the Warsaw Treaty Organization. That includes, of course, Russia and Ukraine. I was chief of the agency's Information Operations Center, which is their euphemistic title for cyber operations and influence operations. I was the chief of operations for counterterrorism, which means in practical terms all the agency's counterterrorism operations lamentably many of which have been disclosed in recent years, were my direct responsibilities. Those were my principal command functions. I did serve 2 tours of duty in Moscow. I was CIA's chief of station there. I ran CIA's Russia House. I have a long background in Russian operations. I know most of the people who are, to the extent Putin listens to anybody, can be considered his advisory circle on geopolitical strategy. It's fair to say that I have a very difficult relationship with those individuals. My job was to steal their secrets and break their things, and their job was to prevent me from so doing. But for the past 10 years or so, as Dean is well aware, I've also been part of a very privileged third track of communications between the government of the United States, government of the Russian Federation. It's a track that consists on both sides of senior former intelligence officers, senior foreign military personnel. It's a channel where we can frankly exchange views on strategic stability, other forms of risk in the global environment in a candid function that only former military and former intelligence officers are able to do, in a way that the Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister, you could never be as frank in your public comments as we can be in this channel. And it's given me, I think, a way to keep my finger on the pulse of the hardline thinking that's driving Putin and Russian behavior in the past decade or so. And I want to mention that in the context of being a CIA operations officer, you're not going to be very effective in that role if you just understand and can only articulate the U.S. or the Western position on a given issue. It's very helpful to understand how the enemy thinks. If you understand how he thinks, you can anticipate how he will act, and you will have a better opportunity to influence his behavior and or achieve your operational objectives. So when I do little geopolitical discussions, often people will say, this guy sounds like a shill for Moscow or a shill for Beijing. I don't necessarily support their views at all. I just try to understand them and therefore articulate to an audience that might not have had the direct experience of dealing with these guys for most of their adult life, to understand how they think and why they're doing what they're doing, which is often, as certainly in the case of the invasion of the Ukraine, completely illogical from a Western perspective. But if you don't understand how these guys think and what motivates them, you're never going to understand this behavior. You'll be surprised every time. And it's not just Russia, Ukraine. It's China, Hong Kong. It's China, Taiwan. It's South China Sea and the militarization of the Spratlys and other atolls in the South China Sea. Why are they doing this stuff? Why does it matter? China's economy is growing. The country is prospering. Why are they doing this stuff? Why are they risking a war or a conflict? Why did Putin put himself in a situation where a struggling economy is now broadly sanctioned around the globe, and he's cutting off his nose to spite his face as Europe weans itself from reliance on Russian energy? None of this stuff makes any sense. Over the Ukraine, most Americans before the 24th of February couldn't have located the Ukraine on a map. And now we find ourselves in a situation where in 2022, 60 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we're talking about a nuclear war again. Well, how can we get in this situation? If you don't understand how guys like Putin think and Xi think, and for that matter, Kim Jong-un or Ali Khamenei in Iran, you're constantly going to be surprised behind the 8 ball as far as geopolitical and market risk are concerned.
Well, Rob, as you described your background, I'm just juxtaposing it versus my own. So I went to college. I learned a thing or two about option pricing. I got to a Wall Street job, learned a little bit about this program called Bloomberg, and that's about it. So yours is a little more complex and colorful than mine.
If you ask me to explain options trading and derivatives, I would be it would be a foreign language to me and no possibility of me understanding it. So there's checks and balances on both sides of stuff.
And I think this is where geopolitical risk is so fascinating. I mean, some might say, in general, it's more bark than bite. There's been a lot of breathlessness in terms of media coverage. And then, at least with respect to asset price reactions, sometimes they just don't materialize. And I would say that you can make that case, but the complexity of this stuff doesn't enable itself to be modeled in a spreadsheet. And so some of it's just not obvious. And so here's where I wanted to go with this. Most of the conversations on this podcast are about market risk. You've spoken to a lot of clients that we've jointly engaged together. You've spoken in New York at Sparks a bunch of times. We had you out in Deer Valley. And my favorite, of course, is Vegas in 2015. So this goes back 7 years, and even that's a different world. But the thing that's, I think, so interesting, and this is where I wanted you to go next to give us some context, is the history of markets certainly matters. When you have a global financial crisis, the response to it matters because, for example, it creates a whole new regulatory regime. There's a backlash against banks. And so it means that the next crisis is probably not going to be a banking crisis. It might be something else. We're dealing with a pretty challenging inflation struggle at this point. So the reaction to things matters in markets. But in geopolitics, the backstory is everything. And I think this is what you were saying, is to gain an appreciation for how these folks think, these bad actors, let's say, that they would be called in the mainstream media in the US or by the administration. And it doesn't mean that they're good actors, but I think their goals and intentions are much more complicated than they're made out to be just by reading The Economist or Financial Times. And so I'd love for you, let's maybe start with Russia. And I want to read your own quote here. This is from something you wrote back in July. So the war is underway. It's 4 months in, not 8 months in. And it's probably not going all that well so far. So this is what you wrote. You wrote, despite Russia's difficulties, Putin believes he is on an historic, if not religious, mission, and he's not about to quit. Whatever false optimism may have existed about the Russian president taking a, quote, off-ramp or passing away due to his many reported maladies should now be dispelled. Putin is in it for the long haul. So tell us about what gets you to that, and go back as far as you feel is necessary to give our audience some perspective on how Putin arrives at invading the Ukraine. And you mentioned it didn't seem like a obvious economic thing to do, but he did it anyway. So obviously his decision-making is influenced by a lot of the back history. Why don't you give us some perspective on that?
Yeah, sure, Dean. First, I want to offer an observation on something that you said kind of in the introduction to that question, and that is that most geopolitical risk doesn't happen. That's absolutely true. I mean, if you were to chart out the potential geopolitical risks that could result in war, conflict, or market disruption in some fashion over the past 20 years, most of them have come and gone without really much more than a ripple. And even what I would say seminal events, 9/11 or whatever, they're disruptive to markets in the short term. But what I think we're facing now is something that's fundamentally different. We've now got a global divide involving the major economic players, United States, European Union, China, Russia, and to a lesser extent, India and Japan, and other countries on the periphery in Asia, that you just can't ignore. It's affecting commodity pricing, it's affecting currency pricing, it's affecting energy supply, which affects industrial production, manufacturing, all that stuff, supply chain disruption. All these things that have now become common terms are a function of the manifestation of geopolitical risk that actually happened. For me, the secret sauce to being an advisor to you guys and to many other financials on geopolitical risk is being able to look beyond the headlines, being able to draw on my experience as an operations officer, street work in Moscow and Beijing, some of the nastiest places on the planet if you're a CIA operations officer. I mean, Beijing and Moscow can be wonderful places, but if you're a spy trying to do your job on the streets there and the local security service trying to prevent you from doing that, it can be a pretty hostile environment.
No welcome mat there.
Yeah, there's absolutely no welcome mat there. 5 years in Moscow, I can tell you that was plenty for me, and the chances of me going back there are zero and none because it would be a one-way trip. I'd be in the penal colony right next to Brittany Griner, if not worse. But at any rate, you learn a lot from understanding the culture of your opponents. If maybe opponents isn't the right word, but let's just say your current or potential geopolitical adversaries. And I go back to, I'll just bring a couple of anecdotes from earlier in my career. I happened to be stationed in Germany at the time that the wall came down. And there's been a lot written by historians and commentators and others about the intelligence failure of the CIA not anticipating the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's actually complete nonsense. The agency said all along that the structure there is crumbling. It's going to fall apart. Could you pick the day? Could you pick November 9th, 1989? No, nobody could. Hell, Gorbachev couldn't. But you could see what was happening. You could see East German citizens resisting their government in a more structural and broad fashion than we'd ever experienced before. They were fleeing East Germany. They were jumping into West German embassies in Budapest, Prague, other places, still within the Warsaw Treaty Organization, but less hostile environments than East Germany. You could see in Moscow, you could see the consequences of perestroika starting to manifest themselves in a way that was never visible under previous general secretaries of the Soviet Communist Party. You could see things happening that if you were an operations officer working your way around the streets, that let you say, man, this thing is crumbling. It's going to break here before you know it. And sure enough, that turned out to be the case. But I learned something from that as I went on in my career as an intelligence officer for the agency is pay attention to what's happening on the streets. Pay attention to it because it matters. It might not matter today, but if it's persistent, then it's going to matter at some point, and understand it and be ready to take advantage of it. As I look at Russia today and the consequence of Putin's unsound strategic thinking in launching the invasion of the Ukraine, I see the same things happening. It's hard to be accurate in capturing the numbers of the people involved, but up to 350,000 draft age, 18 to 40 Russians, plus in many cases their family members, have fled the country since the announcement of the partial and allegedly now completed mobilization. And from the time that the war started, I mean, if you look at, not many people do this, but I do, from the 25th of February, try to book a train ticket from Moscow or St. Petersburg to Helsinki. You couldn't do it, or to Tallinn, or any place else outside of Russia. The trains filled up. The flights filled up. The border crossing points stacked up. People leaving. That means something. You may say, well, there's no widespread protests against the war in Moscow. Yeah, I know. Most of the people have been arrested or they've fled the country. Most of the pressure that Putin's facing right now from within is coming from the hard right, the people that want a stronger czar, a more effective czar, a tougher czar. But I learned something I was less surprised, about the invasion, which, as Dean knows, I said it was coming, it's coming. Putin's not done with the Ukraine. But the thing that seems to have surprised so many is the performance of the Russian army in what was supposed to have been a 72-hour campaign to capture Kiev, depose the Zelensky government, and begin the process of reversing, as the Russians would say, the results of the 2014 U.S.-engineered coup in Kiev. But the Russian army performed miserably at the beginning of the campaign and has continued to perform surprisingly miserably throughout. Here's my take on that. I wasn't surprised because if you lived in Russia and been responsible for the things that I was responsible for in Russia, you viewed the depth of cynicism and the depth of corruption and the impact on the average person, not to mention people responsible for the formulation and execution of policy, of a seriously flawed educational system and a seriously flawed and unsound belief system, represented probably most significantly by Putin's absolutely outrageous interpretations of history that are guiding his behavior now. But those outrageous interpretations of history are largely shared by the Russian population. So that's one thing. I'm not surprised at the ideological basis for the invasion, for what's going on now. The second thing is, if you've observed up close the level of corruption in Russian society, from the average worker all the way up through the factory managers and the leaders of industrial enterprises at the national level, it's corrupt at every single level in that process. There's no accountability. There's no honesty. And so when the Russian army ground to a halt in that famous 40-kilometer-long column heading for Kiev, it was because they didn't have tires for their trucks. They didn't have spare parts. Why? Because those things had been stolen away or they'd never been produced in the first place, and the money was taken from the Russian government coffers and ended up in the pockets of oligarchs or mid-level managers or whomever throughout the society. And that's happened since. The performance of supposedly Russian superior weapons technology has been absolutely miserable. Their precision, quote-unquote, missiles have basically demonstrated that they're capable of hitting the ground. And not always that. So you learn things in tying this back, I hope, to what Dean wanted me to suggest a little bit about my background. The ability to understand what's going on today is you learn some things about how to look at problems in other parts of the world that help you assess the level of risk, whether it's your understanding of what drives the leaders, whether it's your understanding of the flaws, if there are any in a society. And it gives you a pretty good compass for understanding what's going on.
Let me just run with it a little bit. So you've used the term religious, you used the term ideology, and you said that Putin's interpretation of history is a significant interpretation. It's his own. We may not agree with it, but I'm curious, what might be one or two of the critical events that perhaps defined that interpretation to get him to where he is now?
I think you'd have to start with Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. I mean, Putin had been president of the Russian Federation for about 7 years at that time. He came into the presidency just before 9/11. Russia was in a very weak state. Yeltsin had left the place in shambles, both politically and economically, culturally as well. And Putin knew he had domestic situation that he had to resolve before he could move forward with rebuilding Russia as a significant factor on the world stage. And 9/11 happened, so all of a sudden Russia's major geopolitical opponent goes to DEFCON 4, is invading Afghanistan with a efficacy and fury that was far beyond what Putin or any other Russian intelligence officer or general thought was capable. I know that because I was in Russia and I was dealing with that category firsthand at the time. They were astonished, envious, and desirable at some point of building that capability for themselves. Putin had to deal with domestic challenges first, then rebuild his military, which he largely did at the expense of the Chechen population, before he was prepared to announce, if you will, Russia's reemergence on the global stage, which he did at that Munich Security Conference. And that's when he laid down his remarkably consistent in the past 15 years list of grievances about the West, starting with the allegedly broken promises about the eastward expansion of NATO, about U.S. and Western hegemony in markets and economic systems, whether it's payments, pick your aspect of it, Western dominance in international institutions, ranging from the International Monetary Fund to the UN. The list goes on and on and on. And that was his introductory announcement, if you will, his Putin's, that Russia's back and we're going to start asserting our own interests, not only in our geography, because remember, it was less than a year later that Russia invaded the Republic of Georgia, August 2008. And since then, Putin has been on a consistent path to get the world to recognize, A, the inadequacy of the U.S. Western-led unipolar world, and B, recognize that the world's moving in a multipolar direction and away from the dominance of the United States and the West. I mean, fast forward to last week to Putin's comments at the Valdai Discussion Club in St. Petersburg, where he said exactly the same thing. But in the intervening years, Dean, getting to one other important, I think, aspect of Putin's psychology at the moment that's shared by many Russians, I must say, is this newly found discovery, if you will, of Orthodox Christianity and the value set, as he interprets it, of Christianity. That's been a big part of his feed, if you will, to the Russian domestic audience and to the European and the U.S. right is that I, Vladimir Putin, have a value set that more closely represents the Christianity that you guys remember, and I, Vladimir Putin, reject the neoliberalism that's given us things that we in the West now assume as normal, whether it's gay marriage or you pick your aspect of cultural or social liberalism that's now become common in the West. Putin rejects it and everything it stands for. And he paints himself as a Christian warrior for the return of traditional values and traditional value set. This is a warped interpretation. I mean, what Putin has done in terms of it's deeply, deeply cynical. But nonetheless, it's a message that resonates with large portions of the Russian people. As I mentioned a moment ago, it resonates with the hard right, politically hard and culturally hard right in Europe and the United States. And he hasn't lost that message. There's one other thing I want to draw to your attention that's relevant to the Ukraine. In July of last year, Putin published an essay on, I think what it's called, the unity of the Russian and the Ukrainian peoples. You could, and maybe you still can, pull down an English copy of it on the Kremlin.ru website if you're so inclined. It's a fantastic document. In it, Putin lays claim to territories of former imperial Russia that he claims were stolen from Russia by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in the 13th century. And that forms the basis for his justification, which he's now often repeated, for the invasion of the Ukraine. He's taking territory that belongs to Russia. Putin has rejected the concept that the Ukraine has a claim to independence and that it is distinct from the Russian people. I mean, which is another flawed interpretation of history. What's now known as Russia actually began in Kiev. Moscow was a village without paved streets when Kiev and Ukraine were building massive cathedrals and things. It's the reverse. It's the Ukraine that actually has the claim to the cultural heritage that Putin has absorbed into his view of the Russian imperial and cultural inheritance. But you can go through this essay. I really commend anybody who wants to understand Putin's thinking to read this thing. I mean, he manages to avoid any reference to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which provided the justification, or the practical justification, if you will, for Hitler and Stalin's invasion and partition of Poland in 1939. Again, this was legitimate because Stalin was reclaiming lands that are Russian. It's such a deeply flawed document in terms of showing us how Putin views the world, and he hasn't backed off from it, not one bit. We're now 10 months into this war in the Ukraine. What do you look at Putin's remarks last week at the Valdai discussion group? They're exactly the same rhetoric that's contained in his July essay of last year, and it goes all the way back to his remarks at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. The guy, if nothing else, is consistent. But anyone who thinks that the shellacking that the Russian military has received up to this point in the Ukraine has changed Putin's interpretation of history, his fervent belief in the justice of his cause, you're deeply mistaken. He hasn't changed a bit.
You've described this philosophy, this framework or orientation that he's arrived at as deeply flawed, but it's very clear it's also deeply convicted. And I think this is, as you refer to the long haul. I want to bring in a couple of other variables here and just the complicated nature of this, just with respect to the proximity of Europe to Russia, the dependence of Europe on Russian oil and gas. The gas thing was set to be an absolute disaster. It still might be, but whether it's...
Yeah, we're not through winter yet.
Yeah, it's been warmer. They found a bunch of LNG, and so that price has come down. But I think the prices of these assets becomes a part of the story itself. This is where this intersection of geopolitics and asset prices, specifically commodities, And you could even refer to currencies. We're going to talk about China as well, but that US dollar Chinese yuan relationship is a critical one for global assets. And it's clear that Russia and China are growing closer to some, at least informal at this point, partnership. Here's the first question, just to tie up on the initiation of this war. Is there something unique about this period earlier in the year that you think for Putin was, okay, it's time, we're going to do this? He started talking about it in, I think, amassing troops as early as January or February. I don't know if that's exactly right, but telegraphed it a little bit. What was it about this time that you think might have initiated his decision to go?
That's a really important question, I think. There's two factors that are driving that. One is that Putin was being told by his generals and his intelligence services that Zelensky's popularity was at an all-time low, and that Ukraine was riddled with corruption and its military would be a pushover. So the conditions for what he wanted to achieve militarily, he felt were, and there's a Russian term called correlation of forces. Correlations of forces were about right. The second thing is Putin had been led to believe by his generals that the Russian army was an efficient and well-prepared fighting machine. And the generals would say, look at what we did in August 2008 against the Georgians. Look at what we did in Syria. Look at what we did in Chechnya. Look at how we took Crimea without firing a shot. We're ready to push these Ukrainian farmers right out of the way and achieve our objectives. So he thought, the enemy's weak. My military is a sharpened bayonet and ready to go. And then perhaps more importantly, from Putin's frame of mind, he looked at the array of the Western leaders that he was going to have to deal with. And you can agree or disagree. I'm not making a political point here. I'm saying Putin looks at Joe Biden and says, this is a guy who's a feeble old man, probably corrupt, and he's not somebody I need to worry about. He would have looked at Emmanuel Macron in France. This guy's weak. He's got domestic challenges. He's about ready to engage in another presidential election. He would have looked at Boris Johnson and said, this guy is, his tenure as prime minister is cracking. He would have looked at Scholz in Germany and said, this guy's no Merkel. He's a social democrat. He's part of a weak coalition. His party has a history of accommodation with the Soviet Union and with Russia. He's not going to risk his very fragile consularship by disrupting the economic and energy relations between the Russian Federation and Germany. So he would have looked around the table and said, I, Vladimir Putin, have been president of the Russian Federation on and off, okay? But I've been running the Russian Federation for over 20 years. I've seen U.S. presidents come and go, French presidents, UK prime ministers. I've seen them all come and go. I've beaten them all. And I can beat this cadre that's in front of me now. And I suppose the fourth factor in that, other than, the Ukraine's being weak, my military is strong, I'm facing a bunch of weak Western leaders, is part of what drives Putin's popularity in the Russian Federation is the fact that he has rebuilt Russia as a strategic and global military force, as a player on the world stage. And what reinforces that message for the Russian people is this idea, it's us against the world. And so his messaging before the 24th of February was all about security guarantees, the eastward expansion of NATO, the threat that NATO poses to Russia, the threat that a Ukrainian NATO or the EU poses to Russia. And you Russian people should understand this threat. And I, Vladimir Putin, strong czar, I'm standing up to this. So that kind of all added up to, let's get this done. And that got us to February of this year and where we are today.
Well, I had alluded to some of the discussions around Russia-China. I know that China recently at least suggested that it was a bad idea for Russia to be even talking about nuclear war. So maybe there's limits to the strength of the partnership, but there's clearly something happening there. I think it's just with respect to funding Russia. I know China and India are still buying Russian energy, but
heavily discounted, I might add.
Yep. You spent a lot of time just thinking about China as well. It's a part of the complexity here. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and your analysis of what you see just in terms of the interaction between Russia and China and what that might mean for this war and for the U.S.?
That's a really important question. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that an important element in the timing of Putin's decision to invade Ukraine in February, just after the conclusion of the Beijing Olympics, by the way, and there's a pattern to Putin's aggressive behavior following Olympics that you can go back and do your own research on if you're so inclined. But Putin traveled to Beijing for the opening ceremony of the Olympics and met with Xi on the 4th of February. And certainly in the context of the discussions that they had, Putin, if he didn't specifically say we're going into Ukraine, he clearly alluded to it. You got to look at the pronouncements that came out of that February 4th meeting to understand that it was all about setting the stage for Xi affirming the legitimacy of Russia's security guarantee demands that it had placed, which served as a predicate for the excuse to invade Ukraine. And similarly, Russia turned around and emphasized its support for eventual unification of Taiwan with mainland China. It reaffirmed the legitimacy of Xi's sphere of influence in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia. There was a lot of stuff there in the geopolitical, this is how the world is going to be context that suited both leaders at the time. So Putin clearly felt when he came back from the Olympics that he had Xi's go-ahead for the invasion. Another thing not many people understand, I think, is how close Xi and Putin are personally. They've met over 20 times now. That's a lot. They've vacationed together to the extent that leaders of two such significant countries are able to have vacation at all. They share a common value set, and that value set is based on something I mentioned a little bit earlier in this call. That is that the world is inevitably moving away from a unipolar U.S. Western-dominated world, and a multipolar world is emerging, of which Moscow and Beijing form two important poles. And the fourth pole, I suppose they would throw out if we were including them in this conversation, is the emerging Southern Hemisphere and the legitimacy of its aspirations. So ideologically, they're very aligned. They share a common enemy, the United States and the West, although that's a bit paradoxical from the Chinese perspective because of the economic dependence and interrelationship between China and the United States and China and the West. It's much more complex, of course, than the largely energy-based relationship that Russia and China have. Sure, they trade in many areas, but the basis of the Chinese-Russian economic relationship is hydrocarbons. They've got a lot in common personally, ideologically, and in their worldview. I think that sort of the basis of your question is, did the Chinese say to Putin, go ahead and invade Ukraine, or did Putin ask Chinese permission? The answer is probably no, by inference, and agreement on the principle of spheres of influence, which is very important about Xi and Putin. And Putin's clearly claiming a sphere of influence largely defined by the territories of Imperial Russia, and Xi is doing the same by historical claims that the Chinese have in the South China Sea and elsewhere. But Xi's now just finished, I think this is something you wanted me to get to, Dean. We've just had now the conclusion of the 20th Party Congress, at which Xi was approved for an unprecedented third term as president of the People's Republic of China. So what does that mean now? I think to start with, you have to understand Xi Jinping's value set and his history. And you can go back to his writings, and he has an extensive body of writings as a Communist Party official, and correlate them with his speeches, and more importantly, correlate them with his actions during his first two terms as Chinese president. The first thing that most people in the West don't understand is how deeply committed Xi Jinping is to Marxist-Leninist ideology. There'll probably be people who listen to this podcast and go, Jesus, what are these guys talking about? Marxism, Leninism, that's like in the ashes and dustbin of history. It's not, at least not in the mind of Xi Jinping. Look at what he's done in terms of reestablishing Chinese Communist Party control in the technology sector in China's economy, or anywhere else in China's economy for that matter. Whatever lessons we in the West might have become accustomed to from looking at Xi's two predecessors in the role of president, a more accommodationist, a more market-oriented Chinese leadership, a very historical view of the inevitability of Chinese return to dominance, but a very patient approach, messaging on the world stage of, yes, we're getting stronger, but it's not yet our time. All that has been rejected now by Xi. He's saying, we are strong. This is the time. The lessons of dialectical materialism are being realized in today's world, and now is the time for us to act. Xi probably feels that he has succeeded in accomplishing in his first two terms the reassertion of Chinese Communist Party dominance in every aspect of the Chinese economy and its society. Largely what Putin was doing without the ideological basis in the first 10 years of his presidency in Russia. Now Putin has much more overtly turned to the resurrection of a form of Stalinism in Russia. Similarly, Xi is doing exactly the same thing in China at the moment. And clearly the lessons from the escorting of Xi's predecessor out of the plenary session at the party congress, allegedly because he was not feeling well, is complete nonsense. It was a clear message by Xi to any remaining potential political opposition in China that it's over. I'm the boss now, party's the boss, and this is the path going forward, so get your head around it, or you're going to end up in a very uncomfortable situation. And that brings us to the question that everyone, Marx are saying, you're asking me anyhow, what does that mean for Taiwan? I think you can say with certainty that we have one active conflict on the planet, and that's the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we've got another one that's inevitably coming, and that's the Chinese effort to reintegrate Taiwan with the mainland. It's absolutely going to come within this period of Xi's third term. He's got a 5-year term nominally, 69 years old. It's unlikely that Xi is going to let his 5-year term come to an end without having resolved the issue of Taiwan. It's absolutely coming.
I'd love to just get your take on the U.S. role here. So this longstanding policy of strategic ambiguity. At first, it was unclear if Biden really meant what he was saying. I think he said it a couple of times now. So even giving a lot of room for error in terms of Biden's ability to articulate clearly, he seems to be saying something different. You had Pelosi make her trip. How much of the U.S.'s different take on this is in response to what it sees, but also potentially creating a little bit of counter response with respect to Xi in China?
That's a really good question, and it's a complex one. Clearly, there's a heightened level of irritation between China and the United States, reflected in the renewed and meaningful, I think, political engagement between the United States and Taiwan. You mentioned Pelosi's visit. She's not the only senior congressional leader that's visited Taiwan in recent months. You'll remember Donald Trump accepted a congratulatory call from Tsai Ing-wen, the Taiwanese president, very shortly after he was in office. It was, this is just a mistake. It wasn't. It was part of messaging from Trump that's really been continued, not in a direct manner, by Biden. You can argue whether he knew what he was saying or fully understood what he was saying, but he's now on public record more than once saying the United States is going to defend Taiwan if China invades. And so I think that's the Chinese interpretation now of U.S. adoption of a two-China policy rather than the one-China policy, and getting rid of the strategic ambiguity that you referred to a moment ago. Well, let's talk a little bit about this Taiwan problem for a second from Xi's perspective. He's confirmed as China's president now. He's up there in the pantheon of great Chinese leaders, right next to Mao Zedong, among others. And now he's looking at what he might view as a real opportunity to achieve what is certainly his legacy issue. That's the reincorporation of Taiwan with the mainland. But what's going on now that's different that Xi might not have anticipated in the run-up to the Congress? Well, his strategic partner, Vladimir Putin, isn't doing so well in what was supposed to be the lightning campaign to reintegrate Russia's Taiwan, Ukraine, into the hegemony of the Russian Federation. Not going that well. Oh, and by the way, this much vaunted Russian military isn't performing up to snuff or expectations. Xi might be turning to his generals and saying, what about our military? Let's face it, the Chinese haven't fought a meaningful conflict since their war with Vietnam in 1979. That's a long time ago. Secondly, now Xi is facing a united, we can quibble about how united the West is, a united West that's willing to sacrifice some of its economic interests in the pursuit of defeating Russia and supporting the Ukraine. The West is also recognizing now that it needs to rearm. I mean, this is something that you go back and pick up a newspaper from 2 years ago. I mean, the idea that most NATO members now were going to live up to their 2% of GDP commitments and talk about rearmament. I mean, that was the furthest thing up from being on anybody's minds. Now you've got Schultz, you've got the UK, you've got the French. I mean, Macron's making this a campaign issue, if you will. You've got a rearming West. Oh, and the other thing that Xi might be looking at is, by the way, all this Western technology, it actually works. And the Russian technology, much of which we've copied, doesn't work so well. So what does this mean for our plan to invade Taiwan, Mr. My circle of generals and strategic leaders? Plus, and I think you alluded to this earlier in this call, Dean, Putin has now put on front and center on the world stage the risk of nuclear war. And that's certainly not in China's interests. And I think you're exactly right. I think the messaging from Xi on the 4th of November about there can never be a nuclear war and there can't be a nuclear war in Europe, I mean, was clearly directed at Putin. Like, get rid of this talk of nuclear war. That's the last thing I need right now is for you to crack off a nuke in Ukraine and get the West starting to think about whether they need to station nuclear weapons in South Korea, Japan, and elsewhere right on my border. Let's not go there, Vladimir. The other thing I would call into mind coming out of the Party Congress and in the context of what Xi might be thinking vis-a-vis Taiwan and vis-a-vis the United States, I mean, we're going to learn more. I mean, Xi and Biden are supposed to meet on the margins of the G20 conference at the end of next week. I think that's mostly going to be about sizing each other up and figuring out where the red lines are. But everything's not as rosy for our friend Xi as many might assume. And this stuff affects probably, or highly likely, I would say, his thinking vis-a-vis Taiwan. I've put together, at least for my own reference, working with some colleagues, a list of what I think are 13 current woes that Xi has to deal with. And these affect his economy. These affect his ability to execute his strategic vision. And I'll just run down them really quickly if you think it's sensible, Dean. But
yeah, please do.
The first is the impact of the regulatory crackdown on major tech companies. This is about Chinese Communist Party control, and it's going to continue. Damages precisely those who fueled the PRC's economic growth and competitiveness. Second woe, property sector. It's a source of wealth for most of China's aspiring middle class. It's 30% of GDP, and it's become a symbol of the overall deceleration of China's economy. Third, and arguably the most significant, is the semiconductor industry. It's a cornerstone of Xi's 2025 self-sufficiency plan. The industry is now the target of corruption investigations. Claimed advances in technology were overstated. SMIC, the largest PRC semiconductor manufacturer, predicts vast downturn in sales due to less consumer spending. And U.S. sanctions arguably also hurt the development of PRC's independent production. Semiconductors are critical, as we've all seen and come to experience in the last couple of years of supply chain issues. Self-sufficiency in semiconductor production is a key element of Xi's strategy. That's going to be tough to pull off in the current environment. 4, domestic spending is part of Xi's renovation goal, but retail sales have plummeted due to zero COVID policy. Exports, the linchpin of the PRC's economy, but export growth has slumped from 15% to 4%. Manufacturing sector output, number 6, also decreased because of labor parts issues resulting from zero COVID. 7, high unemployment, up to 6%. Between ages 18 and 24, it's 20% now. 8, aging demographic, long recognized as a coming problem, but now hitting home earlier than expected. The PRC has the second lowest fertility rate in the world. Housing issues and zero COVID are contributing to this. Number 9, brain drain. Young Chinese are uncertain about the future and are starting to emigrate in numbers that are unprecedented and go to London, go to many places in South Asia, and you'll see Chinese everywhere. And these are people that aren't going back or don't want to go back. Belt and Road Initiative. This was the ambitious plan of Xi to extend China's global influence, now plagued by corruption, construction delays, no commercial returns, and inability of nations to pay debts, resulting in the PRC needing to issue rescue loans. 11, geopolitical tensions. Bilateral relationship with the U.S. is in the depths. There's very few areas of bipartisan consensus in Washington. One of them is that China's a bad actor. COVID policy. It's a dictate of Xi, and it's difficult to get around. I know there's some stories out there about efforts now to ease the zero COVID policy, but that's going to be tough to do on the scale that is going to be necessary to reduce its impact on China's economy. And arguably, the last of the 13 woes that nobody's talking about is the looming water crisis. Obviously, global warming is a factor. I mean, there's a current heat crisis in southwest of the PRC, especially in Sichuan. Drastic energy reductions are being experienced. This is affecting industrial output, agriculture, hydroelectric power generation, and, of course, quality of life. I mean, not many people understand the PRC consumes 10 billion barrels of water daily. That's 700 times its oil consumption.
Wow.
19% of the PRC's water is unfit for human consumption. 7% unfit for any use at all. By 2030, that's almost 7 years from now, water could fall short of demand by 25%, according to some estimates. I mean, this is a real problem. And just a note from history, famines caused by droughts toppled 5 of 17 Chinese dynasties. There's a lot of stuff going on that Xi has got to resolve and may take precedence or interrupt his plans for what he wants to do about Taiwan. I mean, there's a lot of storm clouds on Xi's horizon that are going to cause ripples and have geopolitical impact in the next couple of years for sure.
Yeah, and I think the global angst is palpable. You certainly feel it here in the U.S. Even the potential for political dysfunction here seems pretty high. Inflation is a shared risk factor around the world. It often has extreme outcomes just in terms of riots and so forth. So, boy, it feels like a pretty unstable political backdrop. Just rounding out the conversation, and question I always ask you is if we're got the Dannenberg dashboard and we're trying to score the level of risk or uncertainty, if you think about it in terms of probability and impact. And we came at the top of this call by saying that geopolitical risk, a lot of them don't materialize. Doesn't mean you're not supposed to follow them, but you follow them because even though they're low probability, they're generally high impact. And so when you multiply those two, maybe there's some sort of percentile or scoring of risk. And it's a broad question, but Rob, if you kind of step back and look at the many, many years you've been engaged in this and all of these, not just one-on-one conflicts, but the overlap, the correlations, whether it's the Russia-China, that sort of dual, almost bivariate uncertainty. How does it look to you, just in terms of relative to other times when you've been particularly concerned?
That's a good question, Dean. It's a little bit of a tough one. For those of you who don't know, Dean is aware of this. I live in a beautiful spot in the mountains of Colorado. So every day that I wake up and I see the snow-capped peaks out my window, I can't help but be in a good mood and fairly optimistic. But that's just about where my optimism on a daily basis ends, because what I see going on in the world, it really disturbs me. In the context of a politically divided United States of America, with an emerging and arguably soon to be significant isolationist element, and a Europe with a weakened government in the United Kingdom, there's a lot of danger out there. And despite what's happening with Putin's military in the Ukraine, he wanted this war. He got it. He's not done with it. And he's faced with a situation where he's got to escalate. And that's where the talk of the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, or the allegations that the Ukrainians are preparing to use a dirty bomb, come into play. Xi also wanted this war. He didn't want this result, but he wanted this war, because part of Xi's narrative and Xi and Putin's combined narrative is that the West is in a period of decline, and that decline is accelerating. And so now is the right time for us to make our move. Well, Xi's probably not done either. And these two guys recognize that they have no path forward but escalation. They can't de-escalate, especially not Putin, and keep their jobs or regimes. I mean, okay, Xi's not in as politically a sensitive position as Putin is, but Putin certainly is. I mean, Putin has broadcast a series of lies to the Russian people, whether it's his interpretation of history, whether it's the inevitability of his success in Ukraine, whether it's all these allegations of misdeeds by the United States and the West. I mean, his messaging does not allow him to compromise and keep his job. And arguably, the most serious criticism that he's getting at the moment is from his far right, guys like Yevgeny Prigozhin, Ramzan Kadyrov. These guys are saying you're not being tough enough on the Ukraine. And if you've spent any time pounding around Russia outside of Moscow, you know that the view of the average Russian is, why is the Tsar being so weak, and why are we fighting the Ukrainians with one arm tied behind our back? Well, if that's the type of pressure that Putin's getting, what choice does he have but to escalate, to resolve the matter that needs to be resolved, his historical legacy, Ukraine? He's got to escalate. Now, I don't happen to believe that he's inclined to use a nuclear weapon in the near term, but there's other things that he can do, forms of sabotage, if you will. We've already seen the explosions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We've seen other forms of what I believe are GRU activity outside of the immediate conflict zone, Germany and elsewhere. You've seen cyber starting to come into play, and you asked about that a little bit at the beginning of the call. This is still a tool which has largely, up to this point in the conflict, only been directed at the Ukraine and the Baltic states. That's going to change. I guess what I'm saying is that I see the path for our major geopolitical antagonists as leading towards more escalation. China, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine. Iran now clearly has enough fissile material to build a bomb. Nikolai Patrushev, the Russian National Security Advisor, just concluded a visit to Tehran where they talked about buying missiles. I guarantee you they also talked about Russian assistance in helping Iran obtain the technology to weaponize its enriched uranium, put it on top of an ICBM that can strike Europe or the United States. It's no coincidence that the time that Patrushev was in Tehran, the Iranians launched what was a satellite missile that looked a lot like an ICBM. So that's a risk that's out there. Now you've got Bibi Netanyahu is going to form a government in Israel. As we all know, Netanyahu is about Iran. And so what does that mean for security and stability in the Middle East? Jump back to Asia for a second. You've got Kim Jong-un launched 44 missile tests this year. That's more than any year since 2014. According to the South Korean CIA, he's preparing to test another nuclear weapon. Everywhere you look in bubbling geopolitical problem areas, it's trending worse, not better. Okay, one of them has already broken. That's the Ukraine problem. One is certain to break. That's China-Taiwan. What about the Middle East, and what about North and South Korea? They're looming out there. And these smaller conflicts come into play when the world or the West are distracted by the bigger conflicts. So I'm seeing a lot of blinking red lights out there, Dean. And so I think it's a good time to stock up on liquor and ammunition.
There we go. Get some ski turns in as well. But listen, none of it feels very positive, but our listeners are going to really value just the incredible perspective, plain spoken perspective on these hotspots, if you will, because they don't matter till they matter. But it's really good to be able to get your assessment and to understand it from your perspective, which is such an insider's perspective. So, Rob, I learned a ton over the last hour. I really appreciate you spending the time with us. Our guests will enjoy listening to this episode as well. So thanks a lot.
It's my pleasure, Dean. Like I said at the beginning, it's really great to reconnect with you guys, and I'm happy to follow up in any way that you think might be useful.
Awesome. Well, listen, man, have a great weekend. Enjoy it. And I hope we get to see each other soon. We'll try to figure something out. Love to see you.
Okay, that'd be great. Have a great Thanksgiving, Dean, and everybody else. Take care.
You've been listening to the Alpha Exchange. If you've enjoyed the show, please do tell a friend. And before we leave, I wanted to invite you to drop us some feedback, as we aim to utilize these conversations to contribute to the investment community's understanding of risk. Your input is valuable and provides direction on where we should focus. Please email us at feedback@alphaexchangepodcast.com. Thanks again, and catch you next time.